September 28, 1941, 4:15 p.m., Moscow, Central Airfield. William Averell Harriman descended from a Douglas DC-3 onto a tarmac that smelled of aviation fuel, autumn decay, and the particular tension of a city preparing for siege. The air was cold in ways that September in New York never achieved, a foretaste of the winter whose arrival German planners were racing to precede. The sound was aircraft engines and distant artillery, the latter faint enough that visitors might mistake it for industrial noise, but distinct enough that residents understood what it meant. German armies were less than 200 miles from where Harriman now stood, advancing at rates that made the survival of the Soviet state a question whose answer would be determined within weeks. Harriman was 49 years old, the son of Edward Henry Harriman, the railroad baron whose fortune had made the family name synonymous with American industrial power. The younger Harriman had been inherited wealth sufficient to make work unnecessary and had chosen to work anyway, building businesses in banking, shipping, and mining, whose success demonstrated that his father's abilities had been transmitted alongside his father's money. He had been educated at Groton and Yale, had rowed crew and played polo, had moved through circles whose exclusivity was defined by money so old that its origins required no discussion. He was, in short, precisely the type of American capitalist that Soviet ideology identified as class enemy, exploiter, parasite upon the labor of workers whose emancipation required his elimination. He had come to Moscow to save the Soviet Union from destruction. The mission that brought Harriman to this airfield represented something unprecedented in the short history of American-Soviet relations, substantive cooperation between systems that considered each other existential threats, alliance between ideologies that prophesied each other's annihilation, partnership between a capitalist democracy and a communist dictatorship whose philosophical frameworks prohibited the trust that partnership required. 3 months earlier, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union with the largest military force ever assembled, 3 million soldiers whose advance had consumed territory faster than defenders could organize resistance. The Soviet losses since June 22 exceeded anything the war had yet produced. Over 2 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, thousands of aircraft destroyed, entire armies encircled and annihilated. The catastrophe that German planning had designed was unfolding with a precision that suggested the Soviet collapse that German planning had anticipated. Roosevelt had decided that Soviet collapse was unacceptable regardless of what American opinion about communism might prefer. A Germany that defeated the Soviet Union would control resources from the Atlantic to the Urals, would possess manpower and industrial capacity that no combination of remaining powers could match, would dominate a Eurasian landmass whose consolidation under hostile control would threaten American security in ways that oceans could no longer prevent. The ideological objections to supporting Stalin were real. The strategic necessity of supporting Stalin was more real. Roosevelt had extended Lend-Lease eligibility to the Soviet Union in November 1941, had dispatched Harriman to Moscow to negotiate the protocols that would translate eligibility into actual supplies, had committed American industrial capacity to sustaining a regime that American values condemned. Harriman carried with him promises whose fulfillment would require transformations of American production that peacetime industry could not have imagined. 400 aircraft monthly, 500 tanks monthly, thousands of trucks whose delivery would provide mobility that Soviet factories could not supply. The numbers existed on paper that Harriman's briefcase contained. The factories that would produce what the numbers represented were only beginning the conversions that production required. The gap between promise and capability would have to be closed through efforts whose intensity American industry had never sustained, whose success would determine whether the Soviet Union survived long enough for American supplies to matter. The Soviet officials who greeted him at the airfield displayed the careful neutrality of men whose survival depended on revealing nothing that might later be interpreted as ideological deviation. They escorted him to vehicles whose American manufacture he noted without commenting upon, remnants of pre-war trade whose continuation the invasion had interrupted. The drive into Moscow passed through streets where preparations for siege were visible in sandbagged positions and anti-aircraft emplacements, whose crews watched skies that German aircraft had not yet reached but soon would. September 29, 1941, 9:30 a.m., Moscow, the Kremlin, People's Commissariat of Foreign Trade. Anastas Mikoyan sat at a desk whose surface was covered with production reports, shipping manifests, and the preliminary lists of materials that Soviet survival required and Soviet industry could not provide. His office smelled of the tobacco from cigarettes he consumed continuously, the paper that accumulated faster than bureaucratic processing could diminish it, and something else beneath those familiar odors. The particular institutional scent of a building where power was exercised, and where the exercise of power consumed men whose offices now stood empty, their occupants erased from photographs and memories with equal thoroughness. Mikoyan was 46 years old, an Armenian from the mountain village of Sanahim, whose journey from provincial obscurity to the inner circle of Soviet power had required navigation skills that mountaineering could not have developed. He had joined the Bolsheviks as a young man, had survived the Civil War's chaos, had risen through party ranks during the 1920s and 30s, while colleagues whose abilities matched or exceeded his own had been arrested, tried, and executed for crimes that existed only in the confessions that interrogation extracted. The purges that had consumed the Soviet elite between 1936 and 1938 had killed men who had worked in offices adjacent to his own, had attended meetings where he had sat, had been photographed beside him in images that subsequent editing had revised to exclude their presence. He had survived through instincts whose operation he could not have articulated and would not have attempted to explain. The lists before him documented what survival now required on a national scale. Soviet factories were producing tanks and aircraft in quantities that German destruction was exceeding. The evacuation of industrial facilities from western regions to the Urals and beyond was proceeding, but evacuated factories required months to resume production, while German armies required only days to advance. The gap between what Soviet forces needed and what Soviet industry could provide was widening with each week of warfare, a deficit whose closure required external sources that ideology had previously prohibited acknowledging. The Americans were coming to negotiate. The irony was not lost on Mikoyan, whose political survival had included the flexibility to recognize ironies without commenting upon them. The capitalist system that Marxist theory identified as historically doomed was being asked to rescue the socialist system that Marxist theory identified as historically inevitable. The class enemies whose exploitation Soviet propaganda documented daily were being invited to supply the weapons that would defend the workers' state from fascist aggression. The contradictions that dialectical materialism was supposed to resolve were instead being papered over by diplomatic protocols whose ideological implications no one would acknowledge. He had prepared for the negotiations with the thoroughness that his position required and his survival instincts demanded. The lists of Soviet requirements had been compiled through consultations with military commanders whose assessments of need reflected operational realities rather than ideological preferences. The prioritization of those requirements had been approved through channels that led ultimately to Stalin, whose personal attention to Lend-Lease negotiations reflected his understanding that the negotiations would determine whether the Soviet Union possessed the means to continue fighting. Mikoyan's role was translation, converting military requirements into diplomatic requests, converting diplomatic promises into logistical realities, converting American production into Soviet survival. The Americans would want something in return. This was the capitalist logic that Soviet education had taught Mikoyan to expect, the transactional mentality that bourgeois economics cultivated and socialist consciousness was supposed to transcend. What they would want and what could be offered without compromising security that ideological suspicion made paramount were questions whose answers the negotiations would have to discover. Information about Soviet military capabilities could not be shared with allies whose alliance was temporary and whose future hostility was ideologically certain. Trust could not be extended to partners whose system remained an enemy, regardless of what current circumstances required. He gathered the documents that the morning's meetings would require, checking each against the approved lists that determined what information could be shared and what must be concealed. The American delegation would arrive expecting transparency that Soviet practice could not provide. They would have to accept opacity as the price of partnership with a system whose secrets were guarded even from allies upon whom survival depended. Mikoyan understood the awkwardness this would create. He understood equally that awkwardness was preferable to the alternatives that German victory would impose. The negotiations began on September 29th in the Kremlin's conference rooms, spaces whose walls had witnessed decisions that shaped the Soviet state and whose atmosphere retained the accumulated tension of meetings where wrong words had ended careers and lives. The room smelled of polished wood, cigarette smoke that ventilation could not entirely clear, and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces where powerful men gathered to determine outcomes whose consequences extended far beyond the walls containing them. Harriman sat across from Soviet officials whose expressions revealed nothing that their training had not approved for revelation, faces whose neutrality was itself a form of communication, a signal that trust would not be extended regardless of what words might suggest. Lord Beaverbrook accompanied Harriman as the British representative, the Canadian-born press baron whose energy and bluntness provided counterpoint to Harriman's measured diplomacy. The British had been supplying the Soviets since the invasion began, had dispatched convoys through Arctic waters where German aircraft and submarines hunted with increasing effectiveness, had committed resources whose diversion from their own war effort reflected Churchill's understanding that Soviet survival was British survival by different means. Beaverbrook's presence demonstrated that Lend-Lease was not merely American generosity, but Allied strategy, coordination between capitalist powers whose cooperation Soviet ideology had declared impossible, but whose cooperation Soviet survival now required. Stalin himself attended the critical sessions, his presence transforming negotiations that might otherwise have proceeded through subordinates into direct engagement between leaders whose authority permitted commitments that bureaucratic caution would have prohibited. The Soviet dictator was smaller than Harriman had expected, his presence larger than physical stature could explain, the aura of power that surrounded him palpable in ways that democratic politicians rarely achieved. He smoked a pipe whose tobacco scent mingled with the room's accumulated odors, listened more than he spoke, asked questions whose precision revealed understanding that his rural Georgian accent might have caused visitors to underestimate. The lists that Mikoyan had prepared became the framework for discussions whose scope exceeded anything Allied negotiations had attempted. The Soviet requirements were staggering: aircraft in hundreds monthly, tanks in hundreds monthly, trucks in thousands, aluminum and copper and steel in quantities that would strain production facilities whose conversion to war production was only beginning. Harriman presented what America could promise: numbers that represented not current capability but projected capacity, faith that American industry could achieve what American industry had never attempted. 400 aircraft monthly by July 1942. The number represented commitment rather than certainty. projection of production that factories not yet converted would have to achieve. 500 tanks monthly, armored vehicles whose manufacture required steel and labor and machine tools whose allocation would compete with every other demand that total war imposed. Trucks beyond counting, the vehicles whose provision would prove more decisive than tanks or aircraft, because trucks moved supplies and troops across distances that determined whether offensives succeeded or stalled. Stalin pressed for more, his demands reflecting need that could exceed what any promise could satisfy. The Germans were advancing toward Moscow. The factories that should have supplied the Red Army were being dismantled and shipped eastward. The gap between what Soviet forces required and what Soviet production provided was measured in divisions that could not be equipped, offensives that could not be sustained, defensive positions that could not be held. American promises addressed future months while Soviet needs were measured in present days. The first Moscow Protocol emerged from these negotiations as a document whose provisions would reshape both nations' industrial priorities. The agreement committed the United States and Britain to supplying the Soviet Union with materials whose value would eventually exceed $11 billion. Investment in an ally whose ideology remained hostile and whose post-war intentions remained uncertain. The protocol specified quantities and categories, created mechanisms for requests and deliveries, established the framework within which Mikoyan's commissariat would operate for the war's duration. Harriman signed the protocol understanding that his signature committed American workers to labor whose intensity peacetime had never demanded, American factories to production whose scale peacetime had never required, American ships to voyages whose dangers peacetime had never imposed. The promises were made. The fulfillment would require transformations whose possibility remained unproven. The bridge between American capacity and Soviet need existed now on paper. Whether it could be built in steel and aluminum and rubber remained to be demonstrated through efforts whose success was not guaranteed. The protocol's signatures were ink on paper. Transforming ink into steel required crossing distances whose dangers exceeded what conference room negotiations could convey. Anastas Mikoyan returned from the Kremlin sessions to the operational challenges that signatures had created rather than resolved. The logistics of receiving supplies that first had to survive journeys through waters and skies where German forces hunted with increasing effectiveness. His office accumulated reports whose contents documented the cost that delivery extracted from ships and sailors whose sacrifice was measured before the supplies they carried could contribute to the war they were intended to support. The Murmansk convoys became the most visible symbol of Lend-Lease's human cost. Merchant vessels and their escorts sailing from British ports through Arctic waters where geography concentrated German opposition into killing zones that no routing could entirely avoid. The convoys smelled of fuel oil, salt spray, and the particular metallic odor of ships whose steel hulls conducted cold through every surface that sailors touched. Norwegian-based aircraft attacked from above while submarines attacked from below, coordinated assaults whose effectiveness improved as German forces learned convoy schedules and routes that operational necessity made predictable. Convoy PQ-17 would become the most devastating example of what Arctic delivery cost. In July 1942, 35 merchant ships departed Iceland carrying tanks, aircraft, and vehicles whose value the Soviet war effort desperately required. German intelligence detected the convoys sailing. The Admiralty, fearing attack by the battleship Tirpitz, ordered the convoy to scatter, dispersing escorts that might have provided protection and leaving merchant vessels to navigate independently through waters where independence meant vulnerability. German aircraft and submarines destroyed 24 of the 35 ships, sending to the Arctic depths over 400 tanks, 200 aircraft, and 3,000 vehicles whose delivery Mikoyan had been expecting and whose loss his logistics could not easily absorb. The Persian corridor offered an alternative whose distance imposed costs that danger in the Arctic could not exceed. Ships sailed from American ports through the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Indian Ocean to Iranian ports, whose facilities the British and Soviets had jointly occupied for precisely this purpose. The journey consumed months rather than weeks, required shipping capacity whose allocation competed with every other theater's demands, but delivered supplies through routes that German forces could not interdict. The trucks that arrived in Iran then drove north through mountain passes whose engineering had never anticipated the traffic that wartime necessity imposed. American vehicles climbing toward Soviet territory through landscapes whose beauty drivers were too exhausted to appreciate. The Pacific route carried the greatest volume while attracting the least attention. Ships sailing from American West Coast ports to Vladivostok through waters that Japanese observation monitored, but Japanese forces did not attack. The Soviet Union and Japan remained at peace until August 1945, a neutrality that both nations found convenient and that permitted maritime traffic whose cargo supported the Soviet war against Germany, without triggering the Japanese war that Soviet forces could not simultaneously fight. The ships that sailed this route were Soviet-flagged, their American cargo technically transferred to Soviet ownership before departure, a legal fiction that Japanese authorities accepted because acceptance served Japanese interests in avoiding conflict expansion. The Alaska-Siberia air route represented the most dramatic delivery method. Aircraft flown from American factories to Alaska, transferred to Soviet pilots at Fairbanks, and flown across the Bering Strait through Siberian staging points to operational units whose need for air power the route was designed to address. Nearly 8,000 aircraft would traverse this route by war's end, fighters and bombers whose American manufacture was matched by Soviet piloting through conditions that Siberian geography made among the world's most challenging. The cold at altitude exceeded what aircraft systems had been designed to withstand. The distances between emergency landing fields exceeded what engine reliability could guarantee. Pilots died flying aircraft to a front they would never reach, casualties of delivery rather than combat. Mikoyan tracked each route's performance through reports whose statistics documented success and failure in numbers that represented ships sunk, aircraft crashed, trucks lost to mountain roads whose maintenance could not keep pace with traffic. The bridge that connected American capacity to Soviet need was built with human materials whose consumption the building required. Sailors and pilots and drivers whose sacrifice made possible the deliveries that their sacrifice alone could not complete. The supplies that reached Soviet hands arrived diminished by the cost of their arrival, reduced by losses whose replacement required additional shipments, whose delivery imposed additional losses. The arithmetic of Lend-Lease logistics was never simple addition. It was always subtraction from totals whose adequacy depended on production exceeding losses by margins that production could not always achieve. The trucks that survived the journey to Soviet territory became the most consequential American contribution to Soviet victory, a fact that post-war Soviet historiography would systematically obscure, but that wartime Soviet commanders understood with clarity that ideology could not diminish. Mikoyan's commissariat received the vehicles through ports and airfields and border crossings whose processing facilities operated continuously. Trucks offloaded from ships and driven from staging areas to distribution points, where Red Army logistics officers waited with requisitions whose urgency reflected operational needs that Soviet production could not address. The Studebaker US-6 became the symbol of American wheeled transport, a 2.5-ton truck whose design American engineers had optimized for military transport and whose capabilities Soviet drivers discovered exceeded anything domestic production had provided. The vehicle smelled of American paint and lubricants whose formulations differed from Soviet equivalents, petroleum products whose refinement reflected industrial capacities that Soviet facilities could not match. The trucks arrived in colors that Soviet camouflage protocols required repainting. Olive drab transformed to the whites and greens that Russian terrain demanded. American manufacture concealed beneath Soviet appearance, while American engineering remained visible in performance that Soviet engineering could not replicate. 200,000 Studebakers would reach Soviet hands by war's end, vehicles whose quantity exceeded the total truck production of Soviet factories during the same period. The number was staggering when Mikoyan calculated what it represented: mobility for armies whose operations depended on moving supplies across distances that horse-drawn transport could not cover, flexibility for offensives whose success required repositioning forces faster than enemies could respond, logistics for a war whose scale demanded mechanization that Soviet industry alone could not provide. Every Studebaker that arrived was a Studebaker that Soviet factories had not been required to produce, industrial capacity freed for tank and aircraft production that trucks could support but not replace. The Katyusha rocket launcher found its most effective platform on American chassis, the weapon whose psychological impact exceeded its explosive yield, mounted on trucks whose reliability exceeded what Soviet vehicles could guarantee. The rocket's distinctive sound, the screaming that German soldiers learned to fear, launched from Studebaker beds whose stability permitted accuracy that improvised mountings could not achieve. The marriage of Soviet firepower and American mobility produced a weapon system whose effectiveness neither nation could have achieved independently, collaboration written in steel and rubber and explosive, whose ideological implications no one discussed. Mikoyan distributed the trucks through a system whose complexity reflected the scale of the war they supported. Allocation required balancing competing demands from fronts whose commanders each believed their needs exceeded what allocations provided, from industries whose production depended on transport that military operations also required, from agricultural operations whose harvests would feed armies if trucks could move grain from fields to processing facilities. The decisions were never simple, never satisfied all claimants, never escaped criticism from recipients who believed their allocations inadequate and their rivals' allocations excessive. The mobility that American trucks provided transformed Soviet offensive capability in ways that operational histories would document and ideological histories would minimize. Operation Bagration, the 1944 summer offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center, rode on American wheels whose provision had made possible the logistics that the offensive scale required. 23 Soviet divisions advanced along axes whose supply lines depended on truck transport that Soviet production could not have provided in the quantities that advance demanded. The Germans, whose own logistics increasingly depended on horse-drawn transport as fuel shortages immobilized vehicles, faced enemies whose mechanization American industry had enabled. The irony was precise. The capitalist production that Marxist theory condemned as exploitative had rescued the socialist state that Marxist theory proclaimed as capitalism's inevitable successor. The workers in Studebaker's South Bend factory, whose labor Soviet ideology classified as alienated and exploited, had produced vehicles whose contribution to Soviet victory exceeded what liberated Soviet labor had achieved. The contradiction was not discussed in Mikoyan's commissariat or anywhere else that Soviet authority reached. The trucks were received, distributed, and employed without acknowledgement of what their provision revealed about the comparative capabilities of systems whose competition the war had temporarily suspended but not resolved. Mikoyan signed the distribution orders that sent American trucks to Soviet units whose commanders cared nothing for ideology and everything for capability. The trucks worked. They moved supplies and troops and rockets across distances that victories required crossing. The working was what mattered. The implications of why they worked better than Soviet alternatives could wait for peacetime contemplation that wartime urgency could not accommodate. July 12, 1943, 2:30 p.m., Gorky Oblast, Soviet Union, a tank training facility east of the Volga. Guards Lieutenant Dmitry Fyodorovich Loza walked around the vehicle that would become his home, his weapon, and quite possibly his coffin for the duration of a war whose end remained invisible from where he stood. The tank smelled of paint whose formulation was unfamiliar, lubricants whose petroleum origins differed from anything Soviet refineries produced, and rubber whose presence in quantities that Soviet industry could not have provided announced this vehicle's foreign manufacture before any markings could confirm it. The M4 Sherman that Loza was examining had traveled from an American factory across an ocean and a continent to reach this training ground, where Soviet tankers would learn to operate equipment whose engineering philosophy differed fundamentally from everything their previous experience had taught them. Loza was 21 years old, a former student from Chernihiv, Ukraine, whose education had been interrupted by a war that had also interrupted his city's existence, German occupation transforming the home he had known into territory he would have to liberate. He had trained on Soviet tanks whose designs prioritized characteristics that Soviet doctrine valued: low silhouettes that reduced target profiles, sloped armor that deflected shells, mechanical simplicity that permitted field repairs with tools that frontline units could carry. The American tank before him embodied different priorities whose logic he would have to learn before combat tested whether learning had been sufficient. The Sherman was tall. The height was the first characteristic that Soviet tankers noticed and criticized, vertical dimensions that presented targets whose visibility exceeded what survival instincts could accept. Loza walked around the vehicle measuring with his eyes the profile that German gunners would see, calculating angles of approach that might minimize exposure, understanding already that tactics Soviet tankers had developed for Soviet tanks would require modification for American tanks whose geometry demanded different employment. The Americans had built a tank optimized for reliability and crew comfort. The Soviets would have to employ it in a war that valued neither characteristic as highly as the Americans apparently did. The interior revealed the priorities that external dimensions had suggested. Loza climbed through hatches whose size facilitated entry and exit in ways that Soviet tanks' cramped openings did not, dropped into a fighting compartment whose space exceeded anything T-34 crews experienced. The floor was covered with rubber matting, whose cushioning protected feet from vibration and cold, luxury that Soviet tankers found almost decadent in vehicles designed for combat whose discomforts matting could not address. The seats were padded. The controls were accessible without the contortions that Soviet tank operation required. The Americans had designed a vehicle whose crew might survive not merely enemy fire, but the accumulated fatigue that extended operations imposed. The engine that powered the Sherman was a revelation whose implications extended beyond mechanical performance to industry philosophy. The radial aircraft engine that early Shermans employed had been replaced in later models by the Ford GAA, a V8 whose reliability Soviet tankers learned to trust through operations that Soviet engines could not have sustained. The engine started in cold that immobilized Soviet vehicles, ran for hours without the overheating that Soviet engines suffered, required maintenance at intervals that Soviet engines could not approach. The engineering that produced such reliability reflected manufacturing precision that Soviet factories could not replicate, tolerances whose achievement required machine tools and quality control that Soviet factories did not possess. Ammunition storage terrified crews whose survival depended on understanding what happened when shells struck tanks whose fuel and ammunition were inadequately protected. The Sherman's reputation for burning when hit, Ronson, the British called it, after the lighter, whose advertising promised it lit first time, reflected storage arrangements that American designers had prioritized for accessibility over protection. Soviet tankers learned to request the wet stowage variants, whose ammunition bins were surrounded by water jackets that reduced fire probability. Learned to fear assignments to earlier models, whose burning had earned the tank its reputation. Learned that American engineering had produced a vehicle whose crew comfort could not compensate for crew cremation. Loza would command Shermans through operations whose geography traced the Red Army's advance from Soviet territory through Romania, Hungary, and into Austria. The tank whose design he questioned would carry him through combat that Soviet tanks might not have survived, reliability compensating for vulnerability in equations whose solution was never certain until the equations resolved. The materials that captured public attention, tanks, aircraft, trucks, represented only the visible fraction of what American industry shipped to Soviet ports. Mikoyan's commissariat tracked categories whose mundanity concealed importance that dramatic equipment could not match, materials whose absence would have crippled industries that their presence enabled, supplies whose contribution to Soviet victory exceeded what their unglamorous nature suggested. The aluminum, the copper, the petroleum products, the machine tools, the food. These invisible sinews connected American capacity to Soviet need through channels that no propaganda photograph would document, but that no Soviet offensive could have proceeded without. Aluminum arrived in quantities that Soviet production could not approach, metal whose weight translated directly into airframes whose construction Soviet industry could not otherwise have achieved. Mikoyan's commissariat allocated the shipments to aircraft factories, whose production quotas assumed aluminum availability that domestic sources could not guarantee. Factories whose output of fighters and bombers depended on American metal arriving through ports whose vulnerability to German interdiction made every shipment uncertain until its arrival confirmed. The Yak fighters and IL-2 ground attack aircraft that filled Soviet skies contained American aluminum in proportions that no official acknowledgement would specify. Foreign material absorbed into Soviet production without the recognition that foreign contribution warranted. Aviation fuel presented challenges whose technical complexity exceeded what aluminum's relative simplicity imposed. Soviet refineries could not produce the high-octane gasoline that high-performance aircraft engines required, could not achieve the processing specifications that American and British refinery technology had developed, could not fuel the aircraft that Lend-Lease provided with fuel that matched Lend-Lease aircraft's capabilities. The aviation gasoline that arrived through Arctic convoys and Persian corridors smelled different from Soviet petroleum products, chemical compositions whose distinctions were invisible, but whose performance differences pilots could measure in engine response and operational sealing. Nearly 2.5 million tons of petroleum products reached Soviet hands through Lend-Lease, fuel and lubricants whose quality Soviet refining could not match and whose quantity Soviet production could not provide. The aircraft that flew on American gasoline performed at specifications that Soviet fuel would have degraded, capabilities preserved through logistics that spanned oceans and continents to deliver refined petroleum to airfields whose distance from American refineries was measured in thousands of miles. The machine tools that Mikoyan's commissariat received enabled production whose achievement depended on precision that Soviet manufacturing had not previously attained. American lathes and presses and grinding machines arrived with specifications that Soviet equipment could not match, tolerances whose achievement permitted manufacturing consistency that mass production required. The tools were installed in factories whose output they transformed. Soviet workers operating American equipment to produce Soviet weapons whose quality American precision enabled. The food arrived in tins whose labels Soviet soldiers learned to read phonetically without comprehending. Canned meat that propaganda dismissed and hunger welcomed. Calories that kept armies moving when domestic agriculture could not supply what armies consumed. Spam became the most recognized American contribution at the individual soldier's level. Processed pork, whose taste Soviet palates found foreign, but whose protein Soviet bodies required. The soldiers called it Second Front, dark humor acknowledging that American food was arriving while American troops were not. Canned meat substituting for the combat divisions that Soviet commanders had been requesting since 1941. Nearly 4.5 million tons of food reached the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, nutrition whose provision freed Soviet agriculture for domestic consumption and Soviet transport for military purposes. The arithmetic was simple. Every calorie that arrived from America was a calorie that Soviet farms had not been required to produce, Soviet railways had not been required to transport, Soviet logistics had not been required to distribute. The food contribution was invisible beside the tanks and aircraft that photographs captured, but the contribution was measured in soldiers whose strength American calories sustained through campaigns whose demands Soviet agriculture alone could not have met. August 20, 1944, 6:15 a.m. Romania, near Iași, the staging area for Operation Iași-Chișinău. Dmitry Loza sat in the commander's position of his Sherman tank, breathing air that smelled of diesel exhaust, the particular metallic odor of ammunition recently loaded, and the dust that Romanian summer raised from roads whose surfaces had been pulverized by the vehicles that had preceded his column. The sound was engines, dozens of them, American engines whose synchronized rumble announced an offensive whose scale would shatter German and Romanian defenses and open the path toward Budapest and Vienna. The tank beneath him had carried him through months of combat whose lessons had been written in the fates of comrades whose Shermans had burned when German shells found the vulnerabilities that American engineering had not adequately addressed. Lend-Lease had reached its peak scale by the summer of 1944, American production finally achieving the capacity that 1941's promises had required and 1942's deliveries had approached but not attained. The total value of materials shipped to the Soviet Union would exceed $11 billion by war's end, investment whose magnitude defied comprehension until the magnitude was translated into the specific items that dollar figures represented. The tanks that Loza commanded were counted in that total, each Sherman representing thousands of dollars that American taxpayers had provided and American workers had transformed into steel and rubber and glass that now sat on Romanian soil preparing to advance toward objectives whose capture those dollars had made possible. The statistics that would later document Lend-Lease's contribution accumulated through operations whose success those statistics enabled. By 1944, American trucks constituted nearly two-thirds of the Soviet military's wheeled transport, mobility whose provision had transformed Red Army logistics from horse-drawn inadequacy to mechanized capability that German forces could no longer match. Nearly 18,000 American aircraft had reached Soviet hands, fighters and bombers whose presence in Soviet skies freed Soviet aircraft production for types that American factories did not supply. The explosives whose detonations preceded Soviet infantry advances contained American components in proportions that exceeded 50%. Chemical compounds whose manufacture Soviet industry could not achieve in quantities that offensive operations consumed. Stalin understood what the numbers represented, even as Soviet propaganda obscured them. In private conversations with Western diplomats, he acknowledged what public statements denied. that Lend-Lease had provided the margin between Soviet survival and Soviet collapse, that American production had enabled Soviet operations whose success Soviet production alone could not have supported. The acknowledgement was never recorded in documents intended for Soviet audiences. The debt that acknowledgement implied could not be permitted to contradict the narrative of Soviet self-sufficiency that ideological requirements demanded. The aid was received, employed, and officially minimized through a denial whose persistence would extend decades beyond the war that denial was designed to obscure. Loza advanced through Romania in a tank whose American manufacture he had ceased to notice, whose characteristics had become familiar through months of operation that transformed foreign equipment into personal extension. The Sherman's reliability had proven itself through distances that Soviet tanks could not have covered, without breakdowns that American engineering had prevented. The engine started when starting was required. The transmission shifted when shifting was demanded. The mechanical consistency that American manufacturing had achieved permitted planning that mechanical uncertainty would have prohibited. Operations whose timing assumed vehicles would function because experience had demonstrated that American vehicles functioned. The offensive that began on August 20th achieved results whose speed exceeded what planning had anticipated, Romanian defenses collapsing faster than exploitation could follow, German forces encircled before withdrawal could extract them. Loza's unit advanced through terrain whose capture had required days in planning estimates and required hours in operational reality. Success whose achievement vindicated both Soviet tactical skill and American material support. 18 German divisions ceased to exist as effective formations within 2 weeks, casualties and prisoners whose numbers exceeded 200,000, destruction whose scale Lend-Lease had made possible through logistics that Soviet production could not have provided. The advance continued through autumn and into winter. Romania giving way to Hungary, Hungarian plains giving way to Austrian mountains, the geography of Hitler's empire contracting under pressure that American supplies sustained. Loza fought through battles whose names would fill operational histories, whose outcomes would determine the post-war boundaries that conferences would ratify, whose costs would be measured in tanks destroyed and crews killed and Shermans burned by German fire that found the vulnerabilities that survival required avoiding. William Averell Harriman remained in Moscow as American ambassador through the war's final years, watching from diplomatic distance as the supplies he had helped negotiate flowed through the channels that negotiation had established. His office in Spaso House smelled of the wood fires that Russian winters required, the tobacco that diplomatic conversations consumed, and the particular tension of a posting where alliance and suspicion coexisted in proportions that shifted daily. He observed the Red Army's advance toward Berlin, understood that American material was fueling victories whose achievement would transform the ally receiving aid into the rival that post-war competition would produce. The bridge he had helped construct between American capacity and Soviet need remained standing until victory made the bridge unnecessary and ideology made its existence inconvenient. The debt that Lend-Lease represented was never repaid in the financial terms that original legislation had contemplated, Soviet governments declining to honor obligations whose acknowledgement would have contradicted narratives of self-sufficient victory that political requirements demanded. The $11 billion that had crossed the bridge remained an accounting entry whose settlement diplomatic relations could not achieve, investment whose returns were measured in German defeat rather than Soviet payment. Harriman served as ambassador to the Soviet Union until 1946. Watching alliance dissolve into the Cold War whose contours he had anticipated before others recognized what was emerging. He returned to American politics, served as governor of New York, pursued a presidential nomination he never secured, and continued in diplomatic roles whose assignments reflected experience that few Americans could match. He died on July 26, 1986, in Yorktown Heights, New York, 94 years old, his obituaries noting the Moscow negotiations whose success had helped determine the war's outcome and the peace's character. Anastas Mikoyan survived. The survival that had carried him through purges that killed colleagues continued through post-war decades whose political convulsions claimed others whose navigation skills proved inferior to his. He served under Stalin until Stalin's death in 1953, under Khrushchev until Khrushchev's removal in 1964, achieved the ceremonial position of Chairman of the Supreme Soviet, retired into the quiet obscurity that Soviet politics occasionally permitted those whose careers had not ended in disgrace or worse. His memoirs, published posthumously, acknowledged Lend-Lease contributions that official histories had minimized, admissions whose timing ensured they could not affect the reputation he had spent decades protecting. He died on October 26, 1986, in Moscow, 82 years old, the last surviving member of Stalin's inner circle, a man whose political longevity had exceeded what probability should have permitted, and whose survival instincts had been honed through circumstances that killed those whose instincts proved less acute. The Lend-Lease materials he had distributed had helped win a war whose victory had preserved a system whose crimes his survival had required accommodating. Dmitry Loza fought his Sherman through Austria until May 1945 brought the surrender whose arrival transformed soldiers into veterans and combat into memory. He had survived campaigns whose geography traced the Red Army's advance from Soviet territory through 4 countries to the heart of Hitler's empire, had commanded American tanks through battles that Soviet tanks might not have endured, had witnessed the collision of engineering philosophies whose resolution combat had tested and reliability had often determined. The Sherman that had carried him to victory was American in manufacture and Soviet in employment, collaboration whose physical form he had inhabited for 2 years of war. He returned to civilian life in a Soviet Union that could not acknowledge what his experience had revealed about American contribution to Soviet victory. He wrote memoirs whose publication was delayed until political circumstances permitted honesty that earlier decades had prohibited, accounts whose detail preserved what official histories obscured. His book documented the American tanks that Soviet propaganda minimized, testimony from a commander who had fought in equipment whose foreign origin could not be denied by those who had depended on it. Loza died on July 22, 2001, in Moscow, 78 years old. His memoirs translated into English for audiences whose understanding of Lend-Lease his experience could inform. The bridge that had connected American capacity to Soviet need had long since crumbled into the hostility that ideology had always predicted and wartime necessity had temporarily suspended. But the bridge had existed, the supplies had crossed, the victory had been achieved through collaboration that neither system could comfortably acknowledge but that neither system could have achieved alone.